Hello, welcome to another Sonic Lab special. We've got Dave Spiers here from GForce Software. You may remember them because they made the Oddity, which was a loving recreation of the ARP Odyssey synthesizer. But now we've got Oddity2, right?
Yeah. I mean, the original Odyssey was done, I think it was 2001, 2002. So it's had a good life.
Yeah.
And it was time to update it. There were things that we didn't include in the first iteration that, in fairness, we were criticised for, but mainly in terms of polyphony. People wanted polyphonic.
Yeah. I guess in 2001 computers weren't really able to handle, because I mean, you know, your stuff is like really detailed models, so it does require a bit of grunt to kind of make that sound so special, right? Which is fair enough.
Yeah, and there's certain parts of Oddity uses audio rate modulation, so again, that's kind of going to have an impact on CPU use. But more to the point is that when the Odyssey is such a beautiful instrument, Billy Currie referred to it once as the first punk synth because it's got that kind of aggressive, snarling tone. And one of the key characteristics of that is the fact that it's got this ring mod on board, and when you couple that with the duophonic nature of the instrument, you can get these incredibly snarling and aggressive tones.
I think you should let us hear that.
Well, as an example.
Right, so the second note is ring modding the first one, or is it the other way around?
It's absolutely, I mean, it's like, and when you stick to the harmonic intervals.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's a ring mod that makes sense, musically.
And it just sounds amazing. I mean, that's used by bands like Nine Inch Nails, Bite the Hands That Feeds.
So, if you're making it polyphonic, are you losing that then?
Yes, and that's why we didn't make the first iteration polyphonic, because we wanted to steer people in the direction of the character of the synth.
Right.
And obviously adding polyphony, people would start playing chords, and that kind of takes away from what the original instrument was.
Right, so you've got that's the Oddity 1 we've just looked at. So Oddity 2 is running, we've got this running in Logic, right? So it's working as an audio unit, so I'm guessing in this instance?
Yes.
Ah, I see, you've gone for the kind of Mark III 80s orange livery.
Of course, I'm a child of the 70s, so I grew up watching people playing the Mark I and the Mark II. The Mark I is the white one. Interesting, 12 dB filter mostly in that. Mark II, latter parts of the Mark I had a Moog infringing filter that you can look up all sorts of information and misinformation on the web about that. Early Mark IIs did also have a Moog infringing filter, and then obviously that was redesigned. So latter Mark IIs and Mark IIIs have the ARP filter.
Right, okay, so there's only so not all white faces are Moog filters?
No, and that seems to be a fairly common misconception. In fact, it's quite interesting because when we were looking at the filter, the 12 dB filter in the Mark I wanted a cross-section of white face Odysseys to analyse, and I was ringing certain people up, people who really, frankly, should know better, mentioning no names and asking them, you know, what filter have you got?
Mine's the Moog one.
And they'd say it's the Moog one, and I'd go down and open it up, and it was the 4023, which isn't the Moog, it's the 12 dB.
But you've modelled, the other thing that you've done as well as add polyphony is you've modelled those individual filters as switchable in circuit, right?
Yeah, for me that was really important because the Moog filter's just got this zing to it. The 12 dB filter, obviously, it's less steep slope, cut-off slope, and it doesn't attenuate the bottom end a little bit more. And it's actually quite akin to like the SEM type filter.
Right. Okay.
So I like the idea of having the aggressive ARP filter, the zing of the Moog filter, and the creaminess of the...
So this is or, you can have either or. So
yeah.
Have you got an example where we can hear the difference? Because I mean, presumably they have quite different sonic characteristics.
Yeah, I mean, this is a simple sweep. I mean, it's just a single oscillator sweep on the envelope. So this is the 12 dB filter. So it doesn't self-oscillate.
But it's got that sing-song harmonic.
Really nice, yeah. For me, that's nice and creamy. Now, you can see I've got the res cranked pretty high there. So now if we go to the Moog infringing filter, the ladder filter.
Much more resonance, yeah. So you want to drop that back a bit, would you?
If I pulled that back to about halfway.
Yeah.
So it's got that growl to it.
The harmonics are kind of there are more of them, aren't there? There are greater steps between. There are less steps between the harmonics, so you get that kind of zing 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 on the 12, and then you get the on the.
Yeah. I suppose that may be part to do with the fact that it's a cascading filter in the first place, and then you've got the ARP filter. Again, if I crank the resonance right up, and then drop it back. So ARP, Moog. 12 lead.
Right, yeah, there's quite a difference. So, can you still play it in geophonic mode as well?
Yes.
Right, okay. So you haven't lost that capability, you've just enhanced it.
The idea of polyphony just came from, there's this mythical instrument called the centaur, which actually never saw light of day. It was an ARP instrument that just never, ARP had finished by the time this. I think there was 2 of them in existence, and rumour has it that Pete Townsend's got one, which I'd love to see. I don't think it ever, I think it had a kind of downtime of like 98%. But this idea of playing an Odyssey polyphonically.
Oh, that was the idea. So it's like half horse, half man, half monosynth, half polysynth.
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I've never seen one. I've never even seen a photograph of it. So
wow.
This idea kind of took hold. And it was similar with Imposca in that there was this mythical ASG, the Advanced Synthesizer Generator, or Advanced Sound Generator.
So there was. So you're making this, is rather than just going, oh, it's polyphonic, you're trying to make it into a polyphonic instrument that has the character of the Odyssey.
Yeah, and for us, those things are... Well, they do become slightly obsessive.
Yes, well, I mean, you know, you've been working on this for quite some time, haven't you? And you really kind of get into details. Another thing you've added is a lot more modulation, isn't it? Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, it takes from the Mini Monster. So you've got one of the big criticisms of the original Odyssey and Oddity is that you had a single LFO. So you had to share that pitch modulation at the same rate as any filter modulation, at the same rate as any pulse width modulation. And life's moved on since those days, and we were kind of like, actually, there must be an elegant way of adding more modulation. And obviously with Mini Monster, what we had is the kind of fundamental Mini Moog section, and then at the top you had the extra LFOs that you could add to any of the main parameters. And that was really embraced by loads of people. So we kind of thought, well, it would be really interesting to apply that to the Odyssey and just kind of see what happened. That way you can either use it in its raw form and just ignore all the extra LFO,
or you could just add them,
or you can really get creative. The other thing is that on when we talked to a lot of people who used Odyssey live, not only were you sharing the LFO between, like I say, pitch and filter and pulse width modulation, in terms of modulating from a pitch wheel, it was the same, and you had to assign it. You would assign it to one or other of the oscillators.
Right, so you can't modulate more than one parameter at a time.
Yeah, and most people were saying, actually, we want to modulate both oscillators. We will always use the modulation for modulating pitch, rarely filter in a live situation.
Right.
So what would be nice is to carve that off and have that as a separate LFO. So that's now completely independent.
Oh, so you've got a modulation, a mod wheel LFO effectively.
Yes.
That's just that, right?
Yeah.
So we're talking about polyphonic mode. Can we hear something polyphonic?
Yeah, of course.
Oh, that's nice.
And it's lush. And what's really interesting is over the years I've done a lot of sound design on various synths, and I've never really been able to hit what I'd consider to be a really accurate polymode Vox Humana sound.
And that's called Vox Humana, and that's what you've...
And it's got it.
That's lovely. Is there a limit to the polyphony you can dial in?
It's up to 32 voices. If you're using a lot of the extra LFOs and stuff, obviously that's going to add CPU. There's audio rate modulation on the sample and hold mixer. Again, that's going to have an impact. But I mean, to be honest, I rarely use above kind of 12 voice polyphony anyway.
Right. So we've got XLFOs, and X envelopes as well?
Yes.
Is there any limitation to the number of LFOs and envelopes you can add?
No, not at all. I mean, you can add them to any of the main GUI parameter sliders.
Right.
And I know we've got this on Mini Monster with knobs, but for some reason, for me, when you're applying them to sliders, it just makes sense because you've got a negative value and a positive value, and you get this idea of actually I'm applying it and it's spreading thus.
Right. Have you got any examples of patches using a lot of X modulation? We can check.
Yeah, of course. So This is one of my favourite sounds. So the brighter the illumination, the higher degree of amplitude on an ADSR, from an ADSR or an envelope has been applied. So here you can see we've got inverse envelope, negative. When we look at the VCO coarse tune, we've got a little bit of positive there. Again, coarse tune there, a little bit of positive there.
So really sort of, you just keep going and keep going. I mean, modulation seems to be the kind of real nub of kind of modern software synthesis, isn't it? Because you can kind of remove the limitations of patching. It almost makes it modular, right?
Yeah, and in a way, that's kind of what I've always advocated. It's like a modular, but without the clutter of patch cables.
Without having to buy any patch cables. Let's have a listen to this one then.
So this is a really interesting one because we added a sub oscillator as well, and this does not have any of the frequency modulation sliders or any of those kind of parameters involved. So this is just to kind of reinforce the bottom end or beef it up a little bit more. But I absolutely. Dude, for me, that's better than football or talking to people. I can deal with that all day.
So, am I hearing effects there as well?
Yeah, there's a delay.
Right, okay, but that's it. There's no chorusing or anything. That's lovely. How far can you go? I mean, have you got any patches that just add stupid amounts just because you can?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's sort of fairly obligatory. Let's have a look at Ray Scott's. No, that's not a lot.
Hardly any.
Which is funny.
Well, that hasn't got a lot, but it sounds like it has.
We've just got, everything's modulating at a different rate in terms of the pitch. You've got square waves, all sorts of different waves on each of the oscillator frequency.
How many patches have you personally been making for this thing? Because it seems like, I know that you put a lot of work into this, and as an instrument, obviously, you work on it, yet you still get pleasure from actually playing it. So that must be quite an unusual situation for a software developer to keep that enthusiasm up for an instrument as you're doing it, because you've been working on it for a long time, right? It's
funny. A couple of nights ago, I thought I'll just go through and familiarise myself with some sounds, because obviously post-release, it's been kind of work, bug fixing business. And I was like, I need to revisit it, obviously for this occasion. And I pulled up a really standard, I think it's called string wash. So that's a really straightforward. And then I was just sat at home and I thought, I wonder if we put a little bit of modulation on the oscillator coarse tune here. So this is just VCO1. And I thought, let's set a time. So let's put it around 2/3 of a beat, so you get that kind of interweaving modulation. And then if we just add a real touch, and you can see just here,
just a tiny percentage.
How's that going to sound? And it's really subtle, but honestly, I was absolutely...
Suddenly it was midnight.
And I can do that all night.
It's got a certain, I mean, because the Imposca had some beautiful polyphonic pad stuff, and it sounds like that. Do you think there's a GForce sound that kind of takes your sensibilities and the way you like to or maybe your patches are the commonality?
I like pads.
You like pads?
I do like my pad sound. And actually, for me, it was a really exciting aspect of this, because obviously everything else had been aggressive, funky. People like Herbie Hancock had used it for bass lines. So, I mean, it really does have a broad base of sounds. So, I mean, things like... So, I mean, we all know those sounds. And then another kind of common sound was the sync.
Ultravox.
Slow motion. And we can sweep the sync, obviously, from a controller keyboard. So that's got the aggressive tones. So for me, when I started to compile pads and washes, this can really do it. And that, for me, it was like really exciting. One of the other things that we included was a couple of pan modes. So one is effectively you can spread the voices left to right accordingly. So lower notes.
Like
played
classic
on the
piano
left side.
pattern,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. And then the other one's random, and I love the random when it's used subtly, and particularly in conjunction with pads, because it just opens up that stereo field
So
markedly.
each note in the chord becomes some random...
Yeah, and
right.
it just plays in its own space. And I think, you know, when you use it subtly, it's probably best. I mean, you can have them kind of darting around all over the place, but then it becomes like one of those kind of 80s synth demos that you used to go into shops and hear and go, ooh.
What's wrong with that?
Yeah, okay, child of the 80s. And you can hear...
And that's quite subtle, but you can feel that there's a lot of
Yeah,
width
and
there.
if we open, I mean, we can just, you know, for the purposes of this exercise, open it right out.
Ooh, I like that too. I always feel that if a knob goes up to 10, one should
Push it up there.
just turn it up, you know, generally speaking. But that sounds lovely. I mean, presumably you can map everything to MIDI control, and so you could use it with a kind of hardware controller if you want to get more hands-on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, and that's a really interesting thing, is when we come back to the sync patch, you know, that everybody kind of recognizes. For me, it's too obvious opening and closing the filter. Whereas actually, if you sweep that sync
Yeah,
and
do them both. Oh, that's nice.
it's nasty. I love
Yeah,
it.
that's really nice.
There's one other really simple thing, but for me, when you're using it with a controller, is really effective. People like Billy Currie, when they were playing solos, the Odyssey has got this 2-octave transpose up and 2 octaves transpose down switch. And what he would do is he'd kind of play these solos and just flick it.
Right.
So you get that kind of bounce of the track, and that's what, so when you assign it to a controller,
Ooh, that did sound nice. Actually, speaking of nice patches, obviously, you know, Oddity1 has a whole bunch of patches. What's the kind of route to go from 1 to 2? Will 2 read 1 patches?
it's really interesting because when we started to talk to people about the whole patch management system and how they use it and stuff, we started to ask people, do they use the patch morphing? And it was very polarised. Some people would say, oh, life's too short, I just want it to sound like this. And other people would get really kind of intricate and detailed. So if you save your Oddity1 patch out as a PBK, you can import that into Oddity2.
Right.
But if you've saved it out as an audio, as an AU preset or an FXP via your host, you then have to go in and
Just
make that a
export it
PBK.
out. Right, okay. I gotcha. So any other features in there that are kind of deviated from the original Oddity? There's some additional source you've put in?
Yeah, what's interesting is that obviously back in the day, the Mini Moog had 3 oscillators and the Odyssey had 2. And to some extent, and I like this, the Odyssey was always seen as the kind of less fat rival. And I love the idea that, you know, Billy coined this kind of, it was the first punk synth because it had that kind of aggressive bite to it. So what we wanted to do was just see for our own, you know, just listen for ourselves and just see what it sounded like with a 3rd oscillator. So what we did do is add a 3rd oscillator, but we refer to it as a sub-oscillator because it doesn't have any of those kind of pitch modulation and pulse width stuff. So it is literally just to kind of reinforce the sound. So
that 3rd oscillator only gives you a wave and a frequency. It doesn't give you any pulse width or anything like that.
No. Right. No, the other two, I mean, these are just sawtooth waves. So, I mean, this is VCO1, VCO2, octave higher, and the 3rd one. And obviously, if we just detune the 3rd one,
right, so
you start to get that kind of Moog fatness. So, you know, it's a kind of moot point as to whether, we all know that the 2600 has got 3 oscillators. And we all know that can sound amazingly fat. But what it doesn't have is the sync, which obviously Odyssey always had. So again, here we've got modulation on the sub-oscillator, just square wave, very, very subtle amount of amplitude on there. I mean, we really are talking, you know, like 5%. And if you want kind of broad changes, up and down movements, if you want very precise changes, left to right movements with the mouse will do that. So, I mean, this is one. And for me, that kind of starts to sound D50-ish.
Yeah, I was just going to say. Has it got a 5th in there or a 4th or something on the actual...
So that's quite an interesting one. Obviously, it's still got the duophonic mode, so we've still got that bite. I mean,
It's almost got an MS-20 vibe to it there. It almost emulates the scream of the filter, but through ring mod. It's really curious, isn't it?
Yeah. Again, with a load of modulation, we can put different amounts of modulation on the VCO course tune. So we can create different envelopes for that. This is good for the ADSR, as it were. So they've all got very slightly different rates and times. So when we play a pad,
Right, they all gradually dribble into the chord. Yeah.
And that kind of, things like with the Oberheim, and in fact we borrowed it for the Imposca 2, is that, when you've got all of these voices kind of gliding slightly different rates, it just can sound really beautiful.
So a bit of nuts and bolts stuff, the XLFOs, and are they syncable to MIDI, so you can have them running at rates that are working to a master clock? Or does it work that way?
Yeah, you can run it, obviously sync it to host tempo. However, via the MS Beats button, you can remove it from host tempo. And what happens is some of the there's one patch designer I have to mention who's been utterly brilliant, a guy called Paul Hurst, and he pretty much writes most of his stuff at 110 BPM. And what he found is if he changed the tempo, he didn't want the modulation to change. He wanted the modulation to stay completely consistent.
Right.
So he kind of came back to us with a request that actually if I just push this single button, will it
decouple?
remain it? Yeah, exactly. So yeah, for him that was a kind of really cool thing, and for me too, actually.
And what about envelopes? Because snappy envelopes are also becoming very kind of sought after, aren't they, for that sort of thing? Is there any specific attention? I mean, I don't know how fast the envelopes are on the original Odyssey. Do you?
Yeah, they're snappy. I mean, they're not quite up to Minimoog snappy, but they are. And also because you've got, you can repeat the ADSRs, so you can get that kind of constant retrigger and gating thing. So this was Paul Hurst.
Underpass. So Oddity2 is available now. What format? All the usual suspects?
Yeah, no AAX, so we're still doing RTAS. So yeah, AU, VST, RTAS standalone.
And 3264?
Yes, purely online. Via our site, via Sweetwater, JRR shop in the States, but mostly obviously via ourselves.
And it's just a straight download. I guess without having to have loads of samples and stuff, it's actually not too big a kind of amount of downloads. I guess the patches is probably the largest.
Yeah, because we're also providing the patches in AU preset format, TFX format for Pro Tools users, and what's the other one, FXPs. And actually I'm going to leave here and go and do a load of VST preset conversions as well, but that will be available later on the site.
Right, okay, well Dave, thank you very much for coming down and showing us that. It's worth saying actually that you've done a whole load of videos kind of explaining the deeper functions and how things differ and what have you on the GForce YouTube channel, right? So people should check that out.
GForce TV.
GForce TV, so check that out. But for now, I want to say thank you for coming down.
Okay.
And perhaps you could just play us out with a selection of your favourite patches.
Okay, yeah, thanks.